Chapter 21. Had seen Kabila fly on the wall of Alexander's house. He would have been greatly disappointed. It was that Alexander and Greta didn't clash against each other's wills, but more because the clash of wills came at the airport, 2 hours from Alexander's property. "Greta, you will ride with me," Alexander said for the second time. This time, however, he put the stone, cold steel into his voice so that the female human in front of him would know that the only wise course of action would be to listen to him, instead of obeying the order. Greta put her hand on her hip and turned her perfected teacher's stare on Alexander. "You and I have the same authority. We are both leaders." Her voice was low because she didn't want random humans picking up on what would be a very odd conversation. "I have agreed that it would be safest for Patrick and Isabella if we stayed on your property. But that is where it ends with you stealing my authority from me. I will drive my students back with me because I have a car here, and because I refuse to be stuck on anyone's land. Arguing with me will not change my mind and will only increase our time here. Now, either you let me drive my students with me, or I will find a different clan to stay with. The choice is yours. I've been alive long enough to know that it's not a real choice you're giving me. Greta Clarkson, then we're even. Your choice for me was no better. But I took the obvious one because I knew it was right for the students." She sighed deeply. "Now, in assuming that you will be allowing me to drive. It's a great choice." Alexander grabbed Greta's arm before she was able to turn around. "You may drive because I will not get into an argument with you here in public. However, you will follow me to my property. If you deviate from the path that I set for you, I will drag you out of your car and force you into mine, with you kicking and screaming if I have to. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing Christ's enthusiasm. Will make Patrick feel the need to protect you, which means he will attack me, and then you will kill him to protect yourself." Greta finished. Her voice was nonchalant, but her eyes showed the concern she had for her young charge. "I will follow you." This time it was Greta who grabbed Alexander's arm when he turned to go. "Do not threaten my students again. Do you understand? I will do as you say because I intend on keeping those two safe until their fathers can once more take them. But I will not have Patrick and Isabella think that I am only listening to you for their safety. I am only listening to you for their safety." Greta quickly put in, "But I don't want them aware of it." Alexander didn't bother to acknowledge Greta but instead turned to the Lycan standing guard over the private plane that he and Greta had just stepped off to have the discussion without the children overhearing. He gestured to the man, indicating that the children could come down from the plane. He turned again to Greta. "You will follow me, and Ivan will follow you. I will not let any harm come to you or your charges." "Thank you," Greta said seriously. She knew where her limitations lay. If men like the ones who had kidnapped her and the children in the first place were after the children, she would need the protection Alexander would provide. At least for 6 months. Once the 6 months were over and the children were safely back in their own clans, she would cease to be under Alexander's control. It was only for the children. Greta tried to convince her heart of that as she walked silently with the children to her car. For some reason her traitorous heart seemed thrilled at the idea of staying so close to Alexander. But her reasoning and stubbornness would win out. 6 months, she told herself. She would stay for 6 months and not 1 day more. "Miss Clarkson," Isabella asked once the car had pulled away from the airport, and there was some distance between them and Alexander. Greta looked in the review mirror at her student. "What is it?" "Isabella, have you ever been to Wislow's property?" She didn't say that she thought the question was odd. She simply shook her head. "No, why do you ask?" "Well, rumor has it," Isabella began, "that the Wislow property is in shambles. People say that he doesn't have any clan members because he is so mean. They say that he kills his clan members just for looking at him. They say he even burned down the manor on his property with all his clan members inside." Out of sight of Isabella, Greta rolled her eyes, with a small smile on her face. She once more met Isabella's worried look. "You've been with Mr. Wislow for the last 4 days. Do you really think that he would do something like that?" You shouldn't believe rumors, nor should children be spreading rumors around. It was just children, Patrick whispered. Greta sighed. I don't believe the rumors. She connected eyes with Patrick. No matter who started them. As for your fears, you don't need to worry. I won't let anyone hurt either of you. I didn't at the house in Prague. And I certainly won't on Wislow's property. I don't want you hurt, Patrick said with concern that was beyond his years. I should have stopped you from getting hurt in Prague. Stop, Patrick, Greta ordered. There was one thing she appreciated about being the leader of the two children. Her order was immediately followed. You were not responsible at all for what happened in Prague. There was nothing you could have done, and definitely nothing that I would have allowed you to do. She tucked a stray hair behind her ear. Besides, it's all over. Now we just have to focus on school in the next 6 months. Of course, telling the students not to worry didn't ease Greta's mind at all. For the next 2 hours, she tried to get her mind wrapped around the change in her life. She was the leader of 2 Lycan children who, according to a slew of other male Lycan leaders, were in danger of being attacked and kidnapped, just because she was too frail to keep the leadership. By the time she pulled into the underground garage, she had no more of an idea of what she was going to do. Well, Patrick whispered under his breath as he stepped out of Greta's car and got a glimpse at the garage around him. Greta kept the smile off her face as she glanced around herself. She could understand Patrick's appreciation for the entire garage. The lights that had come on automatically as soon as the car had entered the submerged garage had illuminated the dark space. And that dark space was filled with cars that would appeal to the males of any age. Greta looked from one car to the next. By the time she was finished with the cars in the garage, she turned and met Alexander's eye and raised a brow. Alexander shrugged a shoulder at the questioning look. He liked cars and made a load of money. It was a guilty pleasure of his. Come through this way. I've already called ahead. And my men have already prepared the west wing for you. Greta let Patrick and Isabella enter the house in front of her. Always cautious, Greta preferred to bring up the rear, not allowing for danger to sneak up on those she was watching. From her advantage point, Greta could clearly see that Isabella, and even Patrick, was very impressed with the house around them. Obviously the rumors that had been spread around the Lycan culture about Alexander's property had been vastly exaggerated. Isabella turned to Patrick. Well, she practically mouthed. Patrick only nodded his head. Until Alexander earshot, Patrick decided to stay quiet. Alexander stopped outside of a door. This part of the house will be yours. Greta, everything you will need has been supplied. You have access to the garage and the backyard. I have my men constantly on perimeter guard so they will prevent anyone from getting on this property that would do you or the children any harm. Greta rolled her eyes. She smiled at the way Alexander spun his words. Sure, he said his men guarded the perimeter to prevent harm from getting in. But she knew it was his way of telling her that he had men that would know if she attempted to leave the property. It was that she had any plans to sneak off the property with her students in tow. But she didn't like Alexander's insinuation. However, while the children were within hearing distance, she would abide by what Alexander said. Anything else? She asked with an obvious distaste for what she was hearing. Alexander raised a brow at a tone of voice he had never heard before. Members in his clan, even members in other clans, didn't take a tone like that with him. Taking a deep breath, he managed to let it slide. As leader, you need to give Isabella a sanctuary here. There's a book on Lycan law on your nightstand. Read it. You're going to need to know a lot about our laws for the next 6 months. And after those 6 months, Greta turned to Patrick, who had asked the question. Having dealt with teenagers for most of her teaching career, she knew how to pick up on every emotion teenagers have ever dealt with. And Patrick was trying to take charge. She turned her teacher glare on Patrick. I will deal with that. You will go find your room. Ensure, mister. Winslow has already had one of his men put your things in there. It shouldn't be hard to find. After a quick supper, you and Isabella will be going to sleep. You'll be tired. And both of you have school tomorrow. Will you be going to school as well? Patrick asked. wishing he could just pull Greta away from Alexander and keep her safe in the rooms. He had to remind himself that she was the leader. Yes, Greta replied, giving in to the question. Now do as I say. She waited for Patrick to leave before she turned to Alexander. She swallowed her pride. Thanks for letting us stay here. I know Patrick isn't happy about it. She kept silent about the fact that she wasn't happy either. But thanks. Alexander gently placed his hand on Greta's arm to prevent her from entering her wing of the house. After the children are in bed, he let out a small breath of air. Come find me. The 3 little words had Greta's face flushing, her stomach in knots, and her breath coming out in ragged intervals. She stuttered twice and then clamped her mouth shut. Using the back of his hand, Alexander softly touched Greta's cheek. He was surprised at the bolt of electricity that seemed to bounce from him to her and back again. He had heard talk about what it was like when someone found his mate, but this was the first time he was experiencing it. He loved it. Well, just talk. Alexander clarified. Just come find me. I don't know my way around your house. Greta admitted. She was glad to note that she hadn't stuttered and seemed to have once more contained control over her crazy emotions. One of my men will take you to me. Instead of giving Alexander an answer, Greta settled for shutting the door in his face. She didn't want to have to think through the reasons why she wanted to agree to see Alexander. It was best to focus on Patrick and Isabella. With a sigh, she turned away from the door and headed into the west wing of the house. She cowled and hid the smile from her face as she actually looked around where she was staying. It was an amazing place. She headed for the state of the art kitchen and was surprised at all to find it stocked with food. Alexander was nothing, if not very detail-oriented. She expected nothing less. Despite the state of the art and the plethora of food, neither Patrick nor Isabella had much to eat. Greta was surprised. Traveling thousands of miles, dealing with a new leader, surviving kidnappers, and moving to a new place was more than enough to make anyone tired. After seeing the children to their rooms, which she also noted had been personalized by someone under Alexander, Greta thought about Alexander's request for her to come find him. Wisely, in her mind, she decided that she would fare much better if she stayed away from Alexander until she could get her emotions under control. So, Greta cleaned up the kitchen. Still thinking about Alexander, Greta figured she would search her new home for 6 months. It didn't take her long before she found her bedroom, which she figured Alexander had had a large part in designing. The room was larger than her first apartment. It had a bed larger than she had ever seen before. She trailed her fingers along the expensive bedspread and felt a chill ride up her spine. Snatching her hand back as if it had been bitten, she shook it out and continued looking around the room, using only her eyes. She knew that one of the doors in her room was connected to a bathroom, and for a brief moment she thought about taking a hot bath and hoping that would soothe her mind and allow her to fall asleep. Pointless. Her solid refusal to go meet Alexander weighed so heavily on her mind that she couldn't seem to think on anything else. It would be best to just get everything over with. She would meet with Alexander and be sure that she showed that nothing was ever going to happen between the two of them. Chapter 22. How many men do you have? Greta asked as the unknown man who had walked to the room where Alex was waiting had left them alone. Alexander laughed. More than what the rumors say. Ah, Greta said, studying the room around her while keeping up the conversation. But you let the rumors exist because you like the mystery it shrouds your clan in. He said with a shrug. He gestured to the chair in front of the fire. Sit down, please. I didn't come for a long talk. Greta explained immediately. I just wanted you to know that whatever you think is going to happen between us. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing and patient enthusiasm. To hide his expression from Greta, Alexander turned and poured a drink for him and Wadim and one for Greta. Enthusiasm from others who had found their mates. He knew that Greta was as pulled to him as he was to her. She wouldn't be able to deny her attraction. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He was going to tell her any of that, He liked to see her fight with the pull between them. Releasing the air he was holding, he turned around. He was surprised to see that she was sitting. "Greet her. For tonight, we are just going to talk about your new role as leader over to Like and Children." Again he pointed to the chairs. "Have a seat." The chairs were large and comfortable and swallowed Greta up nearly completely when she sat down. She pulled her feet under her and rested against the soft sides of the chair. She sighed with contentment. "There is one thing I have to say for you Lycans. You really know how to furnish a room. These chairs are even more comfortable than the ones Sinke has." "Well, I'm glad you brought him up first," Alexander said as he held out Greta's drink to her. "I have been wondering why you went to him instead of calling me. I am your protector." Before Greta had left Prague, Sinke had pulled her aside to tell her that Alexander would be demanding answers. He had also told her that it would be wise for her to answer the questions without putting up too much trouble. Perhaps if she was as comfortable as she was or as tired as she was, she would have refused to answer demands from Alexander. As it was, she didn't have the strength to fight Alexander on everything. "I had no choice. I was in your city, and I didn't have your phone number. All I knew was that I was going to have who knows how many kidnappers after me and the children. I did the only thing I could think of. I went to Sinke for help. You weren't there." Her last words were very accusatory. Taking a seat himself, Alexander rested his right ankle on his left knee and took a swallow of his drink. "I never should have let you go." Greta shook her head. "That's not it." He raised a brow, encouraging her to continue speaking her mind. "Are you only my protector as long as I am on American soil? Doesn't your protection extend to Prague? You can't just keep me locked up here and call me protected. I should have gone to Prague because that was part of my job. And you should have protected me because that was part of your job." "That is my job," Alexander clarified. "This is why you are now my property. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Greta looked startled at the female voice that resounded through the door. With a surprised look on her face, she turned to Alexander. He didn't look nearly as surprised as Greta. He looked more irritated by the voice than surprised. "To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." The voice was louder now. The voice turned colder. "So help me. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. If you put your hands on me, I will claw your face off. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." From the safety of her seat, Greta watched as the door opened, and in stepped a woman with the same beauty that Alexander had, but which seemed to glow on the woman's face and through her body. For a moment Greta's heart seemed to freeze as her brain worked through the notion that she had no chance with Alexander that came to the beauty in the room. "To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." And she called him by the name he preferred. Greta noticed. Her heart sank to the pit in the bottom of her stomach, a sound she was sure Alexander heard when he turned to look at her. She attempted to school her face to hide the emotions that seemed to run through her body like a dump truck. She failed miserably, but she was looking at Alexander to see if he noticed. Her attention was riveted on the beautiful woman who had noticed her for the first time. "A human?" the woman asked. Greta managed to speak despite her throat being drier than a desert. "You must be a lichen." The woman laughed, and the sound bounced lightly off the walls. "If I were human, I certainly wouldn't be on this property." "I would be." "Sissy, that's enough," Alexander ordered. "That's not my name. Alice Andre." "Cecilia," Alexander corrected. "That's enough," placing his drink on the table next to his chair. He stood up. For the moment, he completely ignored Greta, deciding it was best to attack one problem at a time. And for the moment, Cecilia was the bigger problem. "What are you doing here? Why aren't you listening to Ivan?" Cecilia placed a hand on her trim waist and scowled at Alexander. "You're back on the property, making you my leader once again. I don't have to listen to Ivan. She knew that her last statement was a lie, so she quickly corrected herself. I don't have to listen to Ivan when he says that I can't see you. As my leader, you have to be available to me. Alexander rubbed his right temple and looked over Cecilia's head at Ivan, who had stepped into the room behind Cecilia. I see that you still have your face. She threatened to cough if you touched her. With a small laugh, Ivan held up his hands. I didn't touch her. Cecilia moved around Alexander and flopped down in the chair he had just vacated. Although when she had first walked into the room her attention had been solely on Alexander, it had since switched to the human who was sitting quietly across from her. You're the female who became leader of the two Lycan children, aren't you? Greta nodded her head, unsure of what the procedure was for meeting a beautiful Lycan. Greta fell back on her human manners. She extended her hand. Greta Clausen. Cecilia, she said as she took the offered hand. Cecilia was low. Greta asked, looking quickly from Cecilia to Alexander and then back to Cecilia again. Are you married to? No, Cecilia interrupted. No way. If Alex was my mate, I would run. Sissy. Alexander warned. Cecilia rolled her eyes. Fine. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I won't run. Are you happy? She didn't wait for an answer but turned back to Greta. No, Alex isn't my mate. Archie's just my leader. But if you would like to be my leader, I will ask you for food and water. Cecilia rose. Alexander warned again. Greta was already shaking her head. No thanks. Cecilia, if I could give the children back to their parents I would. But the Lycans have a weird law about it. They have weird laws about everything. Cecilia agreed. Lucky for you. You're a human and get to walk away from all this. You have to stay here. Alexander glanced over his shoulder and studied Cecilia and Greta. Although the women's tone was low and he and Ivan were talking, he had no problem hearing the conversation going on across the room. Normally he would have reprimanded Cecilia for her attitude, but he stayed where he was. He figured that Cecilia would get Greta to open up much sooner than he could. He couldn't seem to get Greta to talk about anything, and the moment she felt like opening up, she closed down, hoping to cut off the emotions that ran through her body when she came close to her mate. Cecilia laughed at the question. If you ask any of the men on the property, they would say that I get to stay here. I, on the other hand, say that I have to stay here. Alex takes his job as my leader very seriously. I understand that. For some reason he thinks because he is my protector, he gets to tell me what to do. Why don't you just leave here? Greta asked, wanting to change the subject of her and learn more about the mysteriously beautiful woman. Cecilia's laugh was genuine. If I tried to leave here, Alex would have his entire clan after me. However, her voice grew quieter. If you were to become my leader, that's quite enough. Sissy, Alexander said. Although his words were hard, his face had softened as he talked to the woman. He took her arm and tugged her to her feet. You will not be putting ideas into Greta's head. I don't like you ordering me around. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Alexander smiled. Tell that to your mate. He stopped and then smiled. Oh wait, you refused to ask your mate for his name. So you're stuck here with me. Looking over Cecilia's head, Alexander made eye contact with Ivan. Take her back to her sanctuary. And on your way, why don't you try to convince your mate to ask for your name? And that I won't have to be her leader anymore. Cecilia barely smiled, and didn't even try to deny the fact that Ivan was her mate. You would still be my leader in a roundabout way because Ivan is your second. I tried to get him to leave you high and dry, but yes. Ivan smiled as Cecilia lost her train of thought as he moved closer to her. Love, that you eat choking on the word loyal. Although Cecilia had never denied being Ivan's mate, she had steadfastly refused to initiate the binding ceremony. So Ivan waited, but he was quiet about the fact that he was her mate. Sissy, go with Ivan. Alexander ordered. Ask him to be your mate. That's not an order you can give me. Cecilia asked back. She rested her hands on her hips and tilted her head back to look at Ivan. Keep your hands off me. I'm your mate. Ivan argued. He gestured towards the door. Let's leave Alex alone, and I'll try to tell you how awesome it will be if you simply ask for my name. Greta watched as the two left the room. She caught Alexander studying her. His intense stare had her face flushing. Quickly she took a swallow of her drink. What did you mean when you said Cecilia had to ask for Ivan's name? She's Ivan's mate. Alexander answered as he once more took his seat. The book I gave you will have a whole section on it. You can read about it. I need to talk to you about what to expect for the next 6 months. Greta cringed. Why do I get the feeling that I'm going to hate the next 6 months? If you follow my rules, it will be smooth and easy. She had never been the type to follow rules. It came from constantly changing schools and homes all her life. She hated rules. Somehow I think I would have fared better at CKS. She whispered softly into her glass. Alexander's eyes burned black. You'll not bring up CK. You also will never go to him again. Jealousy riddled his words. And it made no sense to him because he was a Lycan. Lycans only had one mate. Greta was his mate. And he was Greta's mate. CK would mean nothing to her. Yet he still didn't want her even thinking about him, much less planning on running to him. I'm your protector. Don't take that tone with me, Greta said. She placed her glass on the table next to Alexander's and stood up. I think this was a mistake to come find you tonight. Obviously you have a lot on your mind. Thank you for letting me and the children stay here. After tonight, I will find other accommodations for us. A deep growl flew from Alexander's lips. Stepping in front of Greta, he gently but firmly took hold of her shoulders and prevented her from moving any closer to the door. I know that in the human world your protection seemed rather lax and important, but this isn't the human world. You have inserted yourself into the Lycan world quite firmly. Lycan law always trumps human law. Because of this, you will follow our law. You will follow my law. I don't. It doesn't matter, Alexander said, dropping his voice considerably. He pressed one of his fingers to her lips. The only thing that matters is that you follow my laws so that you stay safe. I will not let anything bad happen to you, because people will want to harm me, Greta asked with a slight tremor in her voice. I got the finger on your lips to keep you quiet, Alexander reminded her. As for people wanting to harm you, yes, this is why I need you to follow my orders for you. I need to keep you safe. You need to keep Patrick and Isabella safe. I intend on making sure that happens. Greta pulled herself away from Alexander and sequestered herself safely in the chair again. She wanted Alexander to pull her out of the chair and hold her close to his hard chest. But instead of voicing her outlandish ideas, she settled for taking the long draw of her drink. I guess you have ideas about how to keep Patrick and Isabella safe. Right, she told herself. Talking about Patrick and Isabella was safe. It was good. She would focus on that. The word idea implies that you believe that you have a say in the matter. Alexander clarified. You must do as I say. I haven't read the book you gave me, but I'm pretty sure that I am a leader as much as you are a leader. My say, since Patrick and Isabella are in my clan, should actually be more important than yours. Alexander hunkered down on his heels in front of Greta's chair. Softly he took hold of her chin and gently forced her to meet his eyes. He could see the blush in her cheeks but wisely decided to forgo mentioning that. In any other case, yes. The leader of the clan would have the most say in how the protection of the clan worked. Your case is different. I was your protector before you became a leader. I will remain your protector because like a loss is that nothing, except death, can interrupt the role of protector. And death, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Greta's adds sarcastically. Shouldn't happen if there's a good protector there. Alexander ignored her sarcasm. I would prefer that you quit your job at Western Prep. But since that isn't going to happen, I will tell you what will happen. You will take Patrick and Isabella to school with you. I will have 4 of my men with you students at all times while they are off this property. Although they are my men and do not belong to your clan, I have told them that they will follow orders given by you as long as it is meant to keep the 2 safe. Thanks, Greta whispered. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders knowing that she didn't have to be the only protection Patrick and Isabella had when off the property. And what about me? You, Alexander asked. Instead of responding, Greta got to her feet. Never mind, she managed to whisper. I have to get back to Isabella. She still has nightmares, and I don't like to leave her for long. Alexander waited until Greta reached the door before talking. And still you protect her. Greta, they'll be there for you. The last of the heavy weight melted away. The lump in Greta's throat prevented her from talking, so she simply flashed a smile and left the room. Alexander had promised his protection for her and the children. Chapter 23. Head inside and start your homework, Greta said to Patrick and Isabella as she pulled into the underground garage. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. We have to head back to the school, Patrick said. Greta nodded her head. Yes, for the game. She agreed. She was glad to see that the students were still able to find joy in everyday activities. She was also glad that they were going to the game that night. Both of the fathers were going to come, and that would allow Patrick and Isabella to see their families, if only for the night. She sighed and rested her head on the steering wheel for a moment of peace as the children headed inside to do her bidding. A month had passed. Actually 5 weeks, meaning that, including the time in Prague, she was a month and a half done with being a Lycan leader. It hadn't been all bad, but she was looking forward to no longer being in charge of Lycan children, as well as not being under the watchful eye of Alexander. She pushed aside the thought of Alexander. Her reaction to him was getting worse and worse every day. Her heart beat faster with just the thought of his name. When she was in the same room with him, she lost all track of her thoughts. Her brain became like mush, her legs like limp noodles, and her determination was no longer existent. She was like a hopeless teenager in love with a movie star. She would just steer clear of Alexander. She didn't have a problem with him during when she was at school and he was protecting her. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. She rarely saw him, but despite that, she knew he was always close by. It was after her charges were put in bed and she went to find Alexander to talk about the day that she felt the intense urge to jump him. And Alexander wasn't helping any. He would touch her with his rough fingertips, igniting passion with the trail they left behind on her cheek or her arm or wherever Alexander decided to rest his hand. She was helpless. Sighing heavily, she slipped out of the car. She would have to find her will, power, and stay away from Alexander. It was the only solution she could think of. You've been drinking coffee again. Of course her will, power, and determination would last longer if Alexander wouldn't pop up in random places, especially when she was alone. Sighing heavily, she leaned against her car. How can you always tell? Greta asked, wishing that she was locking lips with him instead of carrying on a benign conversation. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. That thought only led to the thought she had just agreed upon in the car. She had to stay away from Alexander. Alexander shrugged. Humans and Lycans both lose that once coffee is introduced into the body. He successfully trapped Greta between the car and his body. He knew what he was doing, and he knew that Greta was trying desperately to pretend that she felt no attraction to him. But she was his mate. It probably would have helped if she knew what mates were, and that Alexander was her mate, but until she learned about them, she wouldn't quite understand why she was so strongly pulled to Alexander. He liked to see her fight against it, knowing full well that he would win in the end. Well, they would both win in the end. He may be playing with Greta, but more often than not his actions ended up getting him burned as Greta walked away from him. Yet, Greta was his mate, and Alexander was as pulled to her as she was to him. He couldn't stay away from her. He wanted her and needed her, for the moment. However, He had to be satisfied just being near her. Reaching up, Alexander propped his hands on the top of the car, turned Greta in, and leaned closer. I like it better when I can find your scent. Greta noticed Alexander's scent, purely masculine, float over her. Her vision undled on Alexander's lips. She was close enough that if she were to move only a couple inches, she could press her lips against his. The ringing of her cell phone snapped her back to reality. Fumbling in her coat pocket, she pulled out the phone, turned it on, and placed it to her ear. She would have started the conversation, but she had met Alexander's eyes and promptly forgot what she was doing, and once more she found her train of thought derailed. "Say hello, Greta," Alexander whispered as he leaned closer to her ear. "Hello." Greta dutifully followed the order. "Hey, Greta," the voice said, coming loud in the otherwise quiet garage. With his lips so close to the pulse beating behind Greta's ear, Alexander figured that he may as well let his lips softly brush against it. He heard her gasp. He smiled at that. "You need to say hi to Amy," he whispered. "Amy?" Greta asked in confusion. Her mind couldn't focus on anything but the way Alexander's breath felt on her neck. "Yes," came the disembodied voice. "This is Amy. Remember me. I'm Amy, your best friend in the whole wide world." Alexander gently covered Greta's free hand. He let his lips hover over Greta's. "Talk to your friend, Greta." She blinked twice. Her focus was on Alexander and his lips that were so close to hers. "Greta," Amy called for the second time. "Are you still there?" Greta reacted as if Amy's voice had been a bucket of cold water dumped on top of her. With impressive ease, she ducked under Alexander's arm and moved away from the man who had had her mind tangling itself into knots. "I'm still here, Amy," Greta reassured her, but she kept her eyes glued to Alexander, wanting to be very aware of every move he was going to make, especially if it was one that would bring him close to her again. Alexander cocked his head to the side and watched Greta carefully. Slowly he crooked his finger and beckoned Greta to come to him. Wisely, she shook her head. Although it took all her willpower, she managed to ignore Alexander and focus on the phone call. "Amy, so sorry. I seem to have a bad connection." She slid onto the hood of one of Alexander's very expensive-looking cars. "What can I do for you?" "Well, I'm just wondering when you're planning on coming to visit. Everyone here misses you. The students have been asking about you since the beginning of the year." Greta saw Alexander stiffen at the question. She knew he would have no problem hearing the conversation over the phone. Even a human would have heard Amy. Although extremely lovable, Amy wasn't exactly the quietest person on the phone. "Even the new students want to meet you," Amy went on when Greta didn't reply right away. "You're not even a teacher here, and yet you're still everyone's favorite. You have to come for a visit." The students refused to take no for an answer. "And, frankly, so do I. You just up and left. I'm still your best friend. And as such, you have to come visit." Greta broke into a laugh. "Fine, Amy." This time Alexander didn't just stiffen, but his face went dark with anger. Greta just looked away, ignoring him. "You've talked me into it. However," she said quickly before Amy could pick a date and book flight, "I have to wait a couple of months, for at the most. So, since Western Prep has a different spring break than you, it'll come up at my spring break time. That way you'll get to see the students, and then you and I will get to spend the weekend together. Going to bars and picking up hot guys," Amy said with a laugh. "You are always so much fun to take to the bars. Every guy hits on you, and you refuse every one of them. So they come to me, and I comfort them." "Disgusting," Amy, Greta said with a smile on her face. Speaking about hot guys, Amy said, "Has anyone caught your eye around Western Prep? According to their webpage, they have some hot fathers. Maybe one of them will be looking for a little love on the side." Greta's eyes flew to Alexander. "No, Amy, I wouldn't date a student's father." "Well, then what about a different guy?" Amy laughed at her own question. "Some guy out there has got to have gotten your attention." "No, Amy, There's no one. To avoid Amy from digging too deeply into the feelings that even Greta didn't want to think about, Greta quickly added, "Look, I have a school thing tonight, so I have to run. I'll call you later. And when spring break gets closer, I'll call you, and we will hash out the details. The students will be so excited when I tell them, perhaps for just a moment, I will be the awesome teacher. I'll talk to you soon." Bye, Greta said, ending the conversation quickly by disconnecting the call. "You will not be going to bars with this friend of yours?" Alexander ordered as soon as the call had been disconnected. Just the thought of random men anywhere near his mate made Alexander's blood run hot. Greta rolled her eyes and ran her hands through her hair. "Since I planned the whole thing for spring break, I won't be the student's leader. I won't be endangering anyone." Moving like liquid mercury, Alexander was in front of Greta before she realized her had moved. Partially he slammed his hands on either side of Greta, denting the hood of his own car with his unhuman strength. "You will be endangering yourself. I will not allow it." "You sound an awful lot like K," Greta said, not at all fazed by the man standing over her. "To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Alexander muttered that the only other voice of reason in your life was another lichen. "My parents weren't that bad," greeted offended lazily. "You look at the world through rose-colored glasses. And you," countered Greta, "see every human as a danger. You're it." She searched for the right word. "Paranoid," she ended. "You're not paranoid." Back away from her. The order bounced through the underground garage. Patrick stood in the opened doorway. His hand gripping the doorframe had changed into his lichen form. His whole body stood on the brink of changing as he watched an clan member confront his leader so closely. Although Alexander didn't care to listen to a lichen who was still a teenager, Alexander knew that Patrick had the right to attack someone from another clan who was threatening his leader. Alexander was a danger to Greta and would be able to kill Patrick with one swipe of his hand. But Patrick wouldn't think about that. As a male lichen, he would only focus on his leader. Speaking about paranoid, Alexander muttered as he pushed himself away from Greta. Turning around, he rested his hip on the edge of his car, folded his arms across his chest, and stared at Patrick. "You know I have no intention of hurting your leader. She's human," Patrick retorted. "You seem to forget that. Since I am her protector, I highly doubt the fact that I have forgotten that she is human." Before either of the two lichens could say any more, Greta spoke as she slid off the card. "Patrick, supper will be ready at 5, so you don't have long to finish your work." She walked up to him and met him eye for eye. "Go inside now." Alexander watched as Greta followed Patrick into the house. It had been futile for him to get Greta to understand that he was her protector, and now he had to add Patrick to the list. Granted, without Patrick and Isabella in the picture, Greta wouldn't be listening to him. Alexander defined that he was grateful for the fact that the children were there. He rubbed the two deads on the hood of his car that his hands had placed there. He would have to send his car to the garage to get fixed. Never before had he acted so rashly or lost control of his own lichen strength. But he argued with himself as he entered his own side of the house. His mate had never informed him that she planned on placing herself in unknown danger before. Greta was only allowing his protection over her because it allowed an umbrella protection for Patrick and Isabella. It was clear, from Greta's conversation with Amy, that once she no longer had to be concerned about protecting Patrick and Isabella, she wouldn't feel the need to keep Alexander's protection. Normally something like that wouldn't have fazed Alexander because he would have simply forced the other person to do as he wished. And Alexander always got his way. But he was starting to think that Greta may not prove to be as easy as the others he had encountered. Chapter 24. Greta looked up as the last bell rang. Her students were on a field trip, giving her the last hour free to grade papers and get grades into her grade book. But that freedom was soon to be over. Patrick and Isabella were soon going to be in her classroom. It was that the guard Alexander sent for the two went off duty as soon as Patrick and Isabella were in her room. But Greta felt the increased pressure of having the two under her protection. The pressure was just getting more and more unbearable each day, and it had barely been 2 months. "Hey, Miss Clausen," Isabella said, as soon as she walked into the room. Patrick only looked Greta's way before falling into the desk closest to the door. He didn't look happy, something that hadn't changed much from the beginning of the year. "How was the field trip, Isabella?" Greta asked, straightening up her papers. "It was wonderful," Isabella said with a smile covering her face. Greta was pleased to see the smile. The last 2 months hadn't given her to charge as much to smile over. It was hard for both of them to be away from their families, although Patrick hid it better than Isabella did. She was hoping that she would be able to give both of them some sort of happiness over winter break. "Patrick and Isabella, you'll be heading back to the house with your guard. I have a meeting and will be back with supper. I expect you to have your homework done when I get back." Patrick looked pensive again. He wanted to override Greta, but knew he couldn't. He settled for moving from one foot to the other. Greta sighed and took pity on him. "What is it, Patrick? Mr. Winslow isn't going to be happy if you don't come back with us." Greta smiled at Patrick's words, wondering to herself which bothered him more. The fact that she was possibly putting her in danger, or the fact that Alexander was the only one who could keep her on the property. "Patrick, you don't need to worry. I have already talked to Mr. Winslow, and I will have the protection I need until I am safely back at the house." She looked up as 2 of the 6 man guard came into the room. "Please take the children back. I expect them to be safe when I get back. Miss Clausen." Greta held up her hand to stop what she knew was going to be a protest from one of the guard. "I have already talked to Alexander. Take them back now." Once more she looked at the children. "Change out of your uniforms and do your homework." "Yes, Miss Clausen," Patrick and Isabella said in unison. They followed after their guard. But Patrick did look back once. He didn't like the whole situation. He could smell the lichens still in the building. It was possible that one of those lichens was there to protect Greta. He didn't have all the sense of the lichens in Alexander's clan, so it was possible. Even still, Patrick would have been happier if he had seen the lichen protecting Greta. He ground his teeth in frustration. He couldn't bring it up because Greta was his leader. Greta slipped on her coat as soon as the guard and her charges had left the room. She wasn't entirely sure what was going through Patrick's mind, but she had a clue. He was too much like the other lichen men she had met. Too protective of her. She was the adult. It was her job to protect them. Uselessly she locked her door. None of her students would want to get in her room, and if Alexander wanted to get in, a lock was going to stop him. But perhaps it would give her a small amount of time to accomplish what she wanted. She had no doubt that Alexander was going to find out that she hadn't come back with her students. She had even less of a doubt that he was going to come look for her. Patrick and Isabella only knew that she would be at the school. He would come there first. Hurriedly she moved to her car. She had no intention of being there when Alexander showed up. He would not approve of what she was about to do. If she were being entirely truthful with herself, she would admit that she didn't exactly approve of what she was doing either. It would, however, make Patrick and Isabella happy, and that was enough for her. It took her 15 minutes to find the restaurant that she had agreed upon. It should have only taken her 10 minutes to find the place, but she had taken a wrong turn and had to wait for 2 lights to make a U-turn. Knowing what she did about lichens, she was surprised to see both the lichen men she had set up the meeting with already sitting down. Despite the look of hatred in both sets of eyes, they stood when she approached the table. "Miss Clausen." She forced herself not to shiver when she heard the eyes covering her name, Mr. Getz and Mr. Dimmick. "Thank you for meeting with me." Finding some last trace of courage that hadn't abandoned her at the sight of the 2 formidable lichen leaders, Greta took a seat and waited for the agitated fathers to do the same. She knew they were angry with her, and she didn't entirely blame them. She would have preferred a bit of gratitude considering she had saved their children. But perhaps anger and irritability was how lichen men showed their gratitude, which would mean that Alexander was going to be extremely grateful once he found out where she had been. William waved away the incoming waitress. Drinks had already been delivered to the table, and none of the guests were thinking about eating. Start talking. Klassen, I don't appreciate being summoned by a female. If you weren't protected by Alexander, Edmund said, trailing his warding off without finishing. Greta grit her teeth. Winter break starts tomorrow. I think it would be good for Patrick and Isabella to go home for the 2 weeks. She could tell that her suggestion was the last thing the men had thought she was going to say. She didn't stop to let her words sink in. She needed to finish what she had come to say before she lost her nerve. There is no law that I could find that didn't say that one. She paused as she found a word to use instead of lichen. One person can't stay with. Again she searched to replace clan. Other relatives. It will be good for them to be with family for a while. Once school starts they can come back and live with me. Winslow will not allow this. William said. Greta narrowed her eyes and held the men with her teacher's stare. She had a bit of fake courage left. Mr. Winslow is not a leader here. I am. It is out of convenience and protection of the children that I am there. If you don't think that your people can protect the children then, we protect our own. Edmund growled. William spoke quickly on his heels. You will do well to remember that we are leaders and will protect our children with our lives. Greet back a smile. Men when all else failed. Just attack the power of a man. His pride would do the rest. Apparently lichen men had that in common with human men. So you find this acceptable? She accepted both nods as a yes. Then, tomorrow after school, I will have both children ready. You will have a guard for them. It was a useless question, but she was still the children's leader. They were to be protected. We will have all that taken care of, Edmund assured her. January 3rd, the first day back to school. I will once more appoint a guard to each child. And if we don't intend on giving our, William repeated with emphasis, children back to you. She had thought about it and had read the logbook Alexander had given her. You would be asking for a war. You may not know this, but I have started learning your laws. The battle wouldn't be with just me, a helpless human, but with all the others who knew you had broken the law of taking children. We will bring our children back on January 3rd. William agreed. He was happy to find that Greta was learning the law. She was a human. She should have been killed. Unfortunately, she was also the leader of his son. Happy to have her mind set at ease, Greta finally wrapped her hand around the water William and Edmund had ordered. She raised it to her lips but paused as the room around her went silent. Greta glanced at her watch. 15 minutes since she had reached the restaurant. She hadn't expected Alexander to find her quite so quickly. However, she had taken care of what she had intended on doing. Patrick and Isabella would be happy, even if Alexander wasn't. Ignoring the whole room and every female's eyes on him, Alexander strode over to the table where Greta sat. Quietly he took the glass from her hand and placed it in front of Edmund and William. You will drink that first if you think for a moment I would allow her to drink something from you. William cleverly dumped the contents of the glass in the potted plant near the table. It wouldn't have killed her. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm, he assured the newcomer. Alex pulled up a seat next to Greta and draped his arm nonchalantly on the back of Greta's chair. Trust me, William, that is the only reason either you or Edmund are still breathing. Well, I can see that you three have a lot to catch up on, Greta said with fake courage. She pushed herself up from the chair. I have to get back. Your car has been taken from you, Alexander informed as simply as if he were talking about the weather. You'll be coming back with me.
If I let you live was silent.
He leaned his elbows on the table and, for everyone looking at them, it looked as if it were simply friends catching up. Greta was looking in. She was not more than a few inches from Alexander, and he was certainly not speaking with a friendly tone. She shivered at the cold that covered Alexander's words. If either of you meet with Greta without me there, I will not let you walk away again. She is mine. He didn't even bother with saying that she was his to protect. She was his. If Greta asks for another meeting, both of you will go through me. I will make you regret it. if you decided to go against my rule, without waiting for confirmation, something that Alexander didn't need. He stood up, took Greta's arm and helped her to her feet. "Gentlemen," he said loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Thanks for the meeting." Although Greta noticed that Alexander had used a more official voice that was cloaked in anger, she noticed that hand that was around her elbow was light, until she tried to pull away from it. Then the velvet that held her turned to steel. "No, Margaret," Alexander whispered, turning the anger that had been directed towards William and Edmund onto her. "I won't let you go. You are too adult to be on your own. I'm afraid I would lose you to your own incompetence if I were to release you." She shivered at the sound of her real name coming from Alexander's lips. The butterflies, currently residing in her empty stomach, went into convulsions. Of course, as he finished talking, the butterflies turned into anger. As soon as they were out of the restaurant, she would let him have a piece of her mind. Incompetence. She was a teacher with 1,000 degrees behind her name. She was a leader of a Lycan clan, small though it be and not really a fair assessment of her abilities. But it sounded good. She was definitely on the same level as Alexander, even if he refused to see it that way. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Incompetent. He was going to get a piece of her mind. Of that she was sure. She let him escort her out of the restaurant into the car. "Alexander, get in the car," Alexander ordered, interrupting what he knew would be a list of great qualifications. He had no intention of listening to her. In not getting in the car until, despite the influx of humans around, Alexander gently but firmly pushed Greta against the car and placed his hands on either side of her to prevent the retreat he saw jump into her eyes. "I am not leaving this up for discussion. You will get in the car because I, your protector, have told you to." He jerked open the door and allowed only that route to be taken by Greta. Sighing heavily, Greta did. She would get her piece in. It didn't matter if it was in the car or in the parking lot. Alexander was going to hear exactly what she thought of him and his ego butting into her plans for her clan members. They were out of the parking lot and getting on the freeway before Greta even had the wherewithal to pull on her seatbelt. A precaution she noticed that Alexander had forgone. By the time she had the seatbelt fastened, Alexander had the car nearly to 100. She shivered again. She opened her mouth to start in on Alexander's rude behavior, but changed her mind when she noticed the surrounding area. "Where are we going?" Her voice raising and widened at the end. "This isn't the way to your house. We are not going to my property," Alexander assured her. He looked her way, his eyes off the road in front of him. Despite the speed he was going, his reflexes were good enough for him to stay above 100 and still maintain eye contact with his shifting passenger. "I am not going to have Patrick jump in halfway through our conversation to protect you." "Patrick?" Greta was confused at the conversation. Her entire focus was on the road that Alexander had ceased looking at. Her fingernails dug into the expensive dashboard as Alexander weaved around the cars that topped out at 80. "You're his leader, and he feels the need to protect you from me." Alexander rolled his eyes as Greta pumped an imaginary brake when his car came too close to the bumper of the car in front of him. He changed lanes without signaling, and the conversation I am about to have would have Patrick in Lycan form. Greta didn't respond. Her focus was still on the road, and her thoughts went to the car companies that didn't have the good sense to put a brake on the passenger side of the car. She finally let out the breath she was holding when Alexander pulled off the interstate on a small exit. Although his speed was excessive, there were no other cars to collide with. She relaxed her foot. She didn't need the imaginary brake. By the time Alexander pulled into an empty farmer's field, she had managed to pry her fingers loose from the dashboard. She was sure she had put permanent fingernail marks in there, but the expensive material showed no sign of her previous concern. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." She thought. The fingernail marks would have been a good warning sign for the next person who sat in the passenger seat of Alexander's car. Her hands shook as she attempted to unclip her seatbelt. She had it off and took a slow, Deep breath. Her nerves were on edge for 2 reasons. One being the near-death ride she had just taken, but that paled in comparison to the man who was currently leaning against the hood of his car. He was angry, and without anyone else there. Greta knew that anger was directed at her, so she did the only wise thing she could. She locked the doors. She would give him time to cool off, and then Alexander held his keys in the air. His back was still to her, but he knew she got the message. Locking the door was no good if the other person had a way into the car. Deciding that facing Alexander couldn't be any worse than facing a room full of middle schoolers, Greta unlocked the door and stepped out into the cool evening. The sun would be setting soon, and even in Texas it got cold during the winter months. Greta wondered why she didn't seem to feel the cold. Then the man in front of her turned to face her. That was why she didn't feel the cold. Her entire body seared with heat straight down to her toes. She felt the blush heat her cheeks. I told you that you weren't allowed to talk with Will or Edmund unless I was there. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Gretel etched onto that. Alexander's eyes may be boring a hole through her, but at least she had her adult mind focused on the problem at mind. She rolled her eyes to herself. Now she was using the word adult to describe herself. Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair. You promised you wouldn't go without me. You lied. There was her full name again. This time she didn't like it. I didn't lie. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Going with his nickname to get her words in faster. I also never promised you I wouldn't go. I told you that you weren't allowed to see those two. You said you understood. And yet you went. How was that not a lie? In the Lycan law book, lying had its own chapter. Greta had known this during her conversation with Alexander and had purposely chosen her words to avoid any falsehoods on her part. I heard what you said. I even understood what you said. But I never agreed to follow your order. I told you I understood so you would think I agreed to listen to you. But I never gave you my word that I would listen. You assumed it. And Lycan law states that your assumptions are not my fault. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I had my reasons. And today I got my answer. Mr. Getz and Mr. Dimmick will get to have their children for winter break. And I didn't die. He dropped his hands and pushed himself off the car. He had moved so fast that he had his hands on Greta before she realized he had moved off the car. You have no idea the danger that you put herself in. I know. I know so much more about how Lycan leaders think. If you had taken a drink of that water. He forced his mind off that dark alley. William and Edmund are not your friends. Greta hadn't let the thought of what had been in that water catch up with her brain. She didn't want to focus on what could have happened if Alexander hadn't walked into that restaurant. I don't want to be friends with them. I am. However, leader of their children. Alexander was pretty sure he was the first Lycan to ever consider strangling his mate. However, surprised him. Instead of wrapping around Greta's neck, his hands pulled Greta to his chest and held her close. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. Greta was a human. He reminded himself. She thought like a human. If it had been a Lycan in her case, he wouldn't have given a second thought to who were the parents. Greta was too soft-hearted, and he didn't want to change that. Alexander breathed in Greta's purely human scent. Suddenly his anger vanished, and only the fact that his mate was in his arms remained. Using his thumb he tilted Greta's face up so he could see her eyes clearly. You're mine. You know. To protect. Greta asked shakily. He growled low. You damn well know I'm not talking about that. Possessive lie. Alexander leaned down and captured Greta's mouth with his. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. As he knew it would be, was mind-blowing. Every thought emptied from his mind when Greta's lips opened. He took every inch she gave, demanding more and more. Greta had to admit that her first reaction when she saw Alexander's intention to kiss her in his eyes was to refuse him. But her brain, which had been fashioned and molded by the progressive feminism of 6 years of college, shut off as soon as the rough lips touched hers. Her stomach was next to go, flipping several times before it simply crashed like a rock. Then her knees gave out. If Alexander hadn't wrapped his arms around her, she would have crumpled to the ground like a wrinkled, wet newspaper. Alexander shifted from Greta's mouth, without realizing what his intention had been. Alexander found that his lips were currently tasting Greta's delicate flesh on the throat, just above the vein. He could feel her blood pulse quickly through her veins. One bite. It was all that it would take to mark Greta forever as his. He let his tongue flick the delicate skin lightly before pulling away from Greta. Alexander looked at Greta. He could see the desire she had for him in his eyes. As much as she pretended that he didn't affect her, he knew she was his mate. She was as pulled to him as he was to her. The kiss they had just shared had simply pulled her desire to the surface. Smiling at his own fortune of finding his mate, Alexander let his thumb lightly caress where his tongue could trail the delicate throat. Greta's blood was still racing. This would be another reason why I didn't take you back to the property. Patrick would surely disapprove. You make it sound like he was my father, Greta said, forcing her adult brain to stay in the conversation. She sighed at her own use of the adult. She was going to have to find a nicer way of describing her intellect when Alexander was around her. Not your father, Alexander assured her, but he is a male I can under your authority way. He searched for the appropriate word. We act differently towards our females when we think they are in danger. But him not a lycan, Greta countered. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. And therein lies the problem. One small bite was all that it would take for him to mark Greta as his own. But that same mark would most likely kill Greta. Humans didn't transform from a lycan bite. They usually died. You're gripping my arms too hard, Greta said. Immediately Alexander relaxed his grip. He flashed a comforting smile towards her. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. We better head back to the property. You can tell Isabella and Patrick that we kissed, Greta asked in surprise. Alexander felt a smile flash on his face for a second. Well, as much as I loved the kiss. No, I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about them heading home for the break. Oh yeah. Oh, Alexander mimicked. He held her door open for her. Come on. Fine, Greta said, flipped her hair over her shoulder. But this time you need to drive slower. You nearly killed us on the way over here. You've never been safer than when you are with me, Alexander growled. Gretel laid her hand on the side of Alexander's cheek for a second before slipping into the car. I think I touched a nerve. She pulled her feet in and waited for Alexander to shut the door. Where he didn't move. She glanced up at him, shading her eyes when the sun behind him blinded her. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Any time now. Alexander slammed the door shut before rounding the car. He slid into the driver's seat, effectively taking up all the available room in the car. He put the keys in the ignition and then dropped his hands. He looked Greta full in the eyes. I don't think you realize how thin the ice is you're treading on. How dangerous can it possibly be? Greta asked. Him sitting beside my protector. I think you would be able to pull me off the ice before it cracks. It would be nice if you would listen to me. Greta, Alexander said. He peeled out of the vacant lot he was in and sped into the freeway. Smoothing it out of cars at speeds that once more had Greta clinging to the dashboard. Slow down. You're completely safe, Alexander assured her. He met her scared eyes and flashed a brilliant smile. He veered to the left to avoid a slower car. Well, if you're not going to slow down, then will you at least keep your eyes on the road? Greta's voice went up at the end as Alexander weaved to the right around a slow car that was only going 80. There's a lot you need to learn about lichens, Alexander said. But he slowed down to double digits and smiled when he saw Greta peel her hands away from the dashboard. About Patrick and Isabella. Yes, Greta prodded when Alexander didn't continue. My men will bring Patrick and Isabella to their old clans. You will not be allowed on either of their properties. To my agent extraordinaire, Mahlin Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. This is absolutely not up for discussion, Alexander ordered. If you go against me on this, I will lock you up. Getz and Dimmick will kill you if you go on their property and then deal with the repercussions afterwards. You will not go on their property. I understand. Alexander remembered the last time Greta told him she understood. No, Margaret. I don't want you to understand. I want you to tell me that you will never go on their properties, nor will you ever meet with them again without me with you. Greta replied dutifully, and I don't need to meet with them again. I got what I wanted. Patrick and Isabella will be home for the next 2 weeks. Kids, even like kids, should be able to spend break with their families. Yeah, you did a great thing. Don't do it again. Despite the wonderful thing that Greta did for her clan members, Alexander did not want it happening again. Greta had no idea the danger she had put herself in. The danger that was trying to get a hold of her because she was a female. Human leader. Greta would have responded to Alexander reminding him that no one was hurt during her meeting with Getz and Dimmick, but something else caught her eye. Alexander had just pulled into the garage speed that Greta didn't approve of, and Greta's car was nowhere to be seen. Where's my car? I told you that your car had been taken away, Alexander said. I thought you were bluffing. Bluffing is lying, Greta, and I don't do either. Alexander stepped out of the car and looked at Greta over the roof of the car. You put yourself in danger today. Because I am your protector. I have the right to do what is necessary to keep you safe. You refuse to listen to me, so I have taken your car away. What about school? Either I or one of my men will take you and the children to school. Greta was about to lay into Alexander for thinking that he had the right to take her car away, but stopped when she heard the door from her wing of the house to the garage open. Patrick stepped out, something that did not surprise Greta. Unless Greta gave Patrick an explicit order to stay in the wing, he would find her if she were ever alone with Alexander. Greta stared at Alexander. For tomorrow, that is fine. We will talk about it then. Putting a smile on her face, Greta turned and headed for Patrick. Come inside. I have something to tell you and Isabella.